Welcome everybody. I'm going to keep it very brief and say, once again, Professor Tony Birch is going to introduce Professor Gary Foley, so listen up.
Okay, just to be sure that we know that there are people here this evening who haven't been here today, so it's very important, therefore, to again acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri country. We need to acknowledge that Wurundjeri people and the Greater Kulin Nation, of which the Wurundjeri people are a part, have never ceded sovereignty to the British, to Europeans, to the Australian government. We speak with that in mind, and we do so with great respect for Wurundjeri and all other Aboriginal people present. And I do want to extend that. I was amiss today to say that we're also with us, of course, people have come from all over Australia, so Aboriginal people from other parts of Australia, we want to pay our respect to you. I mentioned some of those people by name today, but all of you. And of course there are many people here from other parts of Australia and internationally from the Palestinian community. So we want to recognise and pay respect to you and to also recognise your tenacious struggle for your rights and your autonomy, and we are indebted to you for that struggle that you continue to engage with, and we feel so honoured to have you here. That's the good news. Professor Foley, when I was asked if I would introduce him, I did so on the basis, as Professor Foley will attest to, that I am his mentor or his moral compass. And in doing so, when Professor Foley says something that is slightly amiss, I always find the need to correct him publicly to set the record straight. One of the things that Professor Foley said this morning was he predicted his imminent passing. Working with Professor Foley at Mundunny Ballock at Victoria University and being a great friend of his for decades, I can tell you that Professor Foley predicts his passing on a weekly basis. So at some point in the future, his prediction is going to come to fruition. But not tonight, not this week, and not this year. And I need, as way of introduction, to give you a sense of the tenacity of this man. A couple of years ago, Gary Foley had a serious heart attack, and he was rushed to St Vincent's Hospital. I was very busy at the football at the MCG, and my wife contacted me at the football, as Professor Foley would also say, not on a telephone because I don't have one, which frustrates him greatly, on a friend's telephone, which was handed to me by my wife, and she said, Foley's had a heart attack, he's in St Vincent's. Now, it was half-time at the football. My team was down by 5 points. I had to make a decision, would I rush to the hospital in case Foley's predicted imminent passing would come to fruition, or would he see out the game? I decided to stay at the football. True story. And we won the game.
There you go.
And I thought, well, I now need to rush off to the hospital and see Gary Foley before he passes, as he had predicted earlier that week. I went to St Vincent's and I had a copy of one of my novels with me. I always read my own books at half-time at the football. And I went up to the ward it was a twilight game, by the way, so that by the time I got to the hospital, dinner was over, the lights had been dimmed, it was about 8 o'clock, and I went up to the floor and the nurse was at the station. I said, I'm here to see Gary Foley. And she said, unfortunately, he's asleep. I said, can I see him? Can I leave this book for him, my book, so that when he comes to, when he survives his heart attack, he will want to read my fiction? She said, okay. So we went into the ward. I put the book on the side of the bed, and there before me lay Gary Foley in one of those terribly embarrassing hospital gowns. sound asleep with his head on the pillow and his hand under his head. And he looked angelic. And the nurse, and I had this shocked look on my face. And the nurse said, "What's wrong?" I said, "You do not know how frightening this is." To see this man at peace. So, Professor Foley survived that incident, and he will survive many more. He will be around for a long time. And he needs to be around for a long time because not only has he been a major force in this state for Aboriginal rights since about 1970 and across the nation well before that, he has been a major influence on generations of Aboriginal people from that period onwards, including myself. And what we have learnt from Gary Foley has been, one, that our struggle is something that we must attend to all the time. We cannot resolve from that struggle. And two, our struggle only matters. Our struggle only matters if we support the struggle of other people. I have a personal, what I call the barricade test. If I was in the shit and I needed someone to back me up, someone who would never walk away, someone who would always watch my back, who would that person be? And those people I can count on one hand, and the first person I count on that hand is Gary Foley, because he's never wavered from what he sees as his role in life, and that is not, surprisingly, to lead our community, but to be with our community. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it briefly again. When Gary Foley, with others, was successful in having the Northland Secondary College remain open under great struggle against the Victorian right-wing government of Jeff Kennett, Gary Foley stood on the steps of the old Magistrates Court and addressed his supporters, our supporters, and many people that afternoon. The next day, I went to the Aboriginal Health Service, and there used to be a great smoking area outside one of the doors. You're not allowed to smoke anywhere these days, including at a health service, which seems an odd thing. And all the old people were out there smoking and puffing away, and my old man was out there with a few of his mates, and I went out there to say hello to my dad, and someone said, "Did you see Foley on the television last night?" I said, "Yeah," and he said he stuck it up him. He stuck it up him. And then all these old men and women started, Foley stuck it up, and they started doing this sort of impromptu dance. And what you realise in witnessing that is, yeah, it was important to succeed in that struggle against Jeff Kennett, but what it was about is those people being empowered by that outcome. Those people being empowered by what Foley and others had done, to give them strength, to give them value as people. Now, I won't go into it in detail because, and this is quite serious, I get too upset when I think about it, but this university, never understanding that Gary Foley is an activist, is part of a community, not separate from it, have never understood the wishes and demands of our community. This university has always felt that it will employ senior Aboriginal people as gatekeepers to keep our community out of this university, which it has done very successfully. And this university will never understand us as a political community until they understand that Gary Foley is not a separatist, he is not a radical activist, but he is someone who represents the politics of the Victorian Aboriginal community, and it's a politics with a remarkable history. So one of the reasons that Gary Foley came to Melbourne to be mentored by Bruce McGuinness in the early 1970s, I believe, is because he understood the vibrancy, the tenacity of this community, which goes back to the first Aborigines Act being legislated in 1860 to incarcerate Aboriginal people in this state. And I think that's the testament, and that will be his legacy. The other thing I'd like to say, of course, we are in the presence of our guests here from Palestinian people in Australia and overseas. I would say to you that, as I believe myself, we talked in the last session about solidarity. How do we keep the struggle going? How do we stay connected? I would say to you that as long as we have the lessons that we have learned from people such as Foley, we will be in a strong position. And that is never give up, never feel that you're beaten or that you can't get back up, because once that happens to us, we are defeated. And I've never known this man to ever suggest that we can't get back up. So with that, I'll introduce my junior, Gary Foley.
Thank you, comrade. Gee, how do I live up to an intro like that? To get even with Tony briefly, though, first, Tony likes to talk about his books, and the story that I remember about one of Tony's books, a fairly legendary character in Melbourne, for those people who come from Melbourne, is a bloke called Mick Gatto from just up the road here. And Mick Gatto one day, for reasons that are still not clear to me, asked Tony to give him his latest book. And I thought it was wonderfully fantastic that Tony slipped him that book in a brown paper bag. That won't make any sense to anyone who's not from Melbourne, but there you go. It's also, as you may notice, folks, I'm winging this, it's also fortunate that Tony mentioned this very institution where we are right now. This institution, the first Aboriginal historian that this university managed to produce in its first 150 years is this man over here. The second that they managed to produce after 150... Give Tony a cheer, folks. So you folks thought he was just a brilliant novelist, didn't you? But there you go. This university also used to be the workplace of both myself and Tony. Neither of us work here anymore. Tony is now the Bruce McGuinness Memorial Research Fellow at Victoria Uni alongside me out there. A significant part of the reason why we don't work here anymore, Tony's alluded to a bit, but this university also has a fairly bad history in terms of Indigenous stuff. This university is an old colonial university, one of the early colonial institutions of Melbourne. And in the late 19th century, this was a hotbed of eugenics. Some of the most eminent and prominent people in early colonial Victoria were rabid eugenicists, you know. Social Darwinism and eugenicist ideas swept Australia in the mid-19th century. And one of the things that troubled me when I first came here as a student, I came to university very late in life. I was almost 50 years old, and I was happily trundling along with life until an academic at this university insulted me one day by insinuating that I was somehow a lesser human being because I didn't have that little bit of paper that said I was a PhD or a graduate. And so I said, well, you know, I'll come and get you a little Mickey Mouse bit of paper. It mustn't be too difficult. You've got one. And given that I was talking to the head of the history department at the time, that was a bit rude of me, but there you go. But upon arrival at this university, I found myself attending lectures in buildings that were named after people who I sort of regarded as sort of war criminals, in the sense that these were among the rabid eugenicists who were so strongly pushing ideas about racial hygiene and, you know, how you could breed a better society by euthanizing the undesirables in society, undesirables being, you know, poor people, unemployed people, prostitutes, Aboriginals, you know, the so-called mental defectives of society. And I found myself attending lectures at this university in buildings named after some of these characters who'd sort of laid the foundation for what was to come in the way of the so-called Protection Acts and others in Australia, the assimilationist policies that dominated all of the 20th century when it came to Aboriginal people in this country. So I was going to lectures in buildings like the Redmond Barry building. Redmond Barry, some people may know as the man who hung Ned Kelly. But back in the day, Redmond Barry was one of the prominent eugenicists in this town, building named after him. Baldwin Spencer, you know, the so-called father of Australian anthropology. I could give you a full 1 hour lecture on him, but I won't. And there was one building in particular, not far from here, just up the lane up here, going towards Swanston Street, the Richard Berry building. Richard Berry was probably the most, not just notorious because of his ardent belief in eugenics. He was a professor of anatomy at Melbourne University, and in the process, in order to try and prove his ideas about head size and intelligence, he became one of the biggest collectors of Aboriginal skulls in history. And when Tony and I were still going there, we found out one day that there were still 300 of these skulls and other assorted skeletal remains and bits and pieces of Aboriginal people in various departments in this university. But way back then, we're talking almost 20 years ago, Tony and I sort of did start a bit of a campaign against the Richard Berry building, which this university vigorously resisted for 20 years. But the winds of change began to blow through other institutions around the world, and suddenly, in places like Oxford and certain major universities in America, suddenly it wasn't so acceptable to have buildings named after people who'd, you know, in the eyes of some had committed heinous crimes of humanity. And so it was with some pleasure, I think it was earlier this year, that this university finally, after 20 years after Tony and I started agitating for the Richard Berry building to change its name, it's now no longer the Richard Berry building, folks. But it only took them 20 years. It's a red building as you walk out on the Swanston Street, folks. It's now named after some obscure mathematician, although his family would probably crucify me for saying that. But it's no longer the Richard Berry building. But it was eugenics, and which shaped a lot of the policies that later emerged. Aboriginal people have been since the since the mid-19th century, those of our peoples who survived the initial invasion, occupation and massacres and brutality of the early colonial people, were then later subjected to this deliberate racial experimentation. In Western Australia, the so-called protector, and this is one of the crazy things about the way they sort of use these euphemisms. They talk about the protector of Aborigines, when in fact in Western Australia, A.O. Neville, the protector of Aborigines, was conducting Nazi-style racial experiments on Aboriginal people under his care. You may know A.O. Neville from the film Rabbit Proof Fence. He was the villain, played by, what was his name? Kenneth Branagh. And A.O. Neville, in the 1930s, at almost an identical time when the Nazis in Germany were conducting all sorts of weird and wonderful experiments against Jewish people, gypsies, communists and others, the same thing was going on here in Australia, which is largely not mentioned in our history books that we teach our young people, either young people going to high school or young people who go to university. Most people who come to this university study Aboriginal studies get a polyglot of, largely harmless nonsense, which in no way, shape or form enables them to make sense of what is going on in Australia today. And that's what I think is, as a historian, I think that's what's important to be taught in institutions like this or universities, that because at the end of the day we can't talk about decolonisation, we can't talk about liberation without the settler colonial society facing up to the truth of its own history. I mean, here in Australia we had a big bullshit, shonky dodgy government lipstick on a pig idea of reconciliation. Whereas in South Africa, at least post-apartheid, there was an attempt to address the history, bring to account some of those who were still alive for what had occurred, you know. But in Australia, where the government just preferred to, you know, have some nice, squeaky clean, acceptable to white Australians thing called reconciliation. I mean, you know, one of my mantras is reconciliation is not justice. Reconciliation is not justice, especially if it does not come or is not preceded by some form of national looking in the mirror, facing up, or first of all, finding out the truth of their own history. And the various attempts that have been made since the 1970s by Australian historians, the very few in the late 60s, early 70s, who attempted to redress the absence of Aboriginal people in the Australian history books, because Aboriginal people were effectively erased from the history books of Australia right up until the 1970s virtually. But even those historians who bravely tried to make heard the Aboriginal voice, to reveal the Aboriginal experience of Australian history, very quickly by the mid-1970s started getting shot down by this so-called history wars phenomenon that occurred, where great arguments started to develop amongst academic historians all over Australia, egged on by, later on in history, by our wonderful little Prime Minister, John Howard, who warmly embraced the term black armband history, which was to suggest that any attempt to examine and take into account the experience of Aboriginal people in Australian history was to be regarded as some sort of wimpish black armband history. That's not a valid history. In effect, it was almost saying, like Donald Trump says today, it's almost a version of Donald Trump's fake news. The Keith Windschuttles of the world would have you believe that the truth of Australian history is in fact fake news, you know. And so many fronts in Australia, Aboriginal people are fighting for survival, you know. It really does come down to survival, because as I've alluded to earlier this morning, I'm a bit of a pessimist in my old age, which I shouldn't be. And maybe I'm not, maybe I just say this in public talks like this, but it does concern me a bit the extent to which the assimilation project has advanced just in my lifetime, since I was 17 or 18 or so. And it concerns me, because if the end product of assimilation, the end product of an assimilation policy is necessarily that there be no Aboriginal people. If you apply a policy of assimilation against Aboriginal people in Australia, the desired end result is that there be no Aboriginal people. And in the same way as A.O. Neville in the 1930s believed and published a book showing the evidence of his experimentation, he believed that he could breed out Aboriginality in 3 generations. And he produced these nice photographs in his book to allegedly prove his assertion. But it's a difficult thing. I mean, you know, I got the fire in my belly when I was 17 years old. I got a good bashing by the great heroes of the New South Wales Constabulary, a notorious police squad called the 21 Division. That put the fire in my belly. But a few days later, I spoke to a man who became one of my closest colleagues in the early 70s, a man called Paul Coe, and I said, I told him what had happened, and his response was, hand me a book, and said, read this. And I thought, that's a funny response, not a real sympathy, but then I read the book. The book was the autobiography of Malcolm X, and between those two events, that's what set me on the path of believing that it was possible to change. We in Redfern in the late 1960s, early 1970s, a small group, a small collective of young Aboriginal men and women, we were all about 18 and 19, we set up a collective to see if we could do something to alleviate the police harassment and intimidation that was going on in the community that we lived in Sydney. There'd been a mass exodus from the rural areas in New South Wales in 1967 after the old apartheid system broke down in New South Wales, a mass exodus to the city. And so that I moved to Sydney in 1966. By 1968, when I first moved to Sydney, there were 1,500 Aboriginal people living in a slum suburb called Redfern. 2 years later, there were 35,000, which made us the biggest Aboriginal community that's ever existed anywhere, any time in the 80,000-year history of Australia. But the police harassment that emerged as part of that, and part, my bashing was just part of that broader campaign, did provoke, if you like. Well, it put the fire in my belly and in the belly of some other young people who'd been subjected to the same sort of treatment. And we believed, after reading Malcolm X, after being exposed to some other political literature that wasn't readily available in Australia at the time, we started to develop our own ideas and develop our own tactics and strategies. John Maynard this morning was speaking about his grandfather. His grandfather and my great-grandfather were part of that organisation that John's father created. And so, in a sense, some people think that my activism goes all the way back to there. It does in a way. I mean, I didn't know the extent of the amazing things that my great-grandfather did until I'd read John Maynard's book and thesis. And I really, John and I have become very close friends. John's got a very similar academic trajectory to me. He went to university late in life. We both studied history. And he produced research about his grandfather, which changed a fundamental understanding about the resistance that has gone on through the 20th century. If you read an ordinary Australian history book, or if you go to an Australian school, or if you go to this university, your understanding of Australian history will probably show you that, the poor little Abos, they got all these things done to them, and isn't it terrible, and they were just helpless victims, hapless victims. That's not true. From the beginning of the 20th century, people like Fred Maynard, John's grandfather, Jim Doyle, my great-grandfather, and an army of Aboriginal activists in extraordinarily difficult circumstances were drawing on ideas from other places. John's grandfather was influenced by the ideas of Marcus Garvey, and the fact that Aboriginal political activists were drawing on ideas of international black consciousness and black nationalism way back then, in the 1920s. You look at the statements made by, I show my students, the comments made by the first 10 Australian Prime Ministers on questions of race. And once you read what they were saying and see what the activists of the old AAPA were doing in the early 1920s, it's pretty clear who were the more politically sophisticated group of people. So there's been a long history through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, pretty much up to now. There's a strong Aboriginal resistance functioning, but resistance that's functioning in extraordinarily, increasingly difficult circumstances. And one of the things, I just want to say two more things. I spoke this morning about our mutual experience of incarceration. And like I said this morning, a good way of judging us, whether you've got a humane and compassionate sort of society is looking at the jails and who's in the jails and what those jails are like. And it's, I stand before you today, despite all of the great stuff that people reckon that I've done in my life, I stand before you today as a man whose oldest granddaughter is in jail in New South Wales. My oldest grandson has just been released from a juvenile detention centre in Melbourne. It's, so you can, all Aboriginal people in Australia, in the same way as all Palestinian people, I suspect, I can't speak authoritatively, but the ongoing occupation of our homelands, the ongoing attempts to assimilate us, the ongoing and never-ending sort of implications of settler colonialism that is not diminishing but getting stronger, affects all people. You know, I can be a big bullshit, hot, professor of history, produced by the University of Melbourne. But that doesn't insulate me or any others like me from the sort of ongoing daily trauma that all of our families suffer. And so that in part, in its own way, I think is yet another reason why I've always, ever since Mohammed, who is going to be here tomorrow, by the way, which will be great, because I told him I made him an international superstar, and he's probably a bit embarrassed about that. But ever since I first began to understand and appreciate and contemplate the situation of Palestine, not just the Palestinian people, but many other oppressed peoples across the world who, I've met various people of various times. These are the things that motivate people like me. We feel. I mean, when I see some of the stuff that I continue to see to this day on television about what's going on in occupied Palestine and the treatment that people and young people and old people are getting there, it hurts me, I feel that in me, in the same way as I feel when the photograph that Tony showed of young Dylan Volker being tied to that chair and with a spit mask put on him, brutalised, as a kid. He's a kid. Brutalised by these thugs in the Northern Territory, juvenile detention sort of system. I mean, that hurts me. It hurts me when it affects me. And that's probably the reason that Tony believes that I'm not going to die. I'm not going to die. How can I die while there's still so much to be done? And like most... But when I do, even though I'm going to live forever, but when I do die, I expect, I think like I said this morning, that tragically, like generations before me, of those who've believed in justice and freedom and have fought all their lives in Australia, every generation of Aboriginal political activists preceding me, every person who put their life, their entire lives into a struggle for freedom and betterment for their own mob, they all died knowing that their entire life work came to pretty much naught. And I've got a terrible suspicion that I might go the same way, but standing here in front of you lot and looking at you, here I see hope, and I see hope as my phone rings, which this is probably somebody ringing up saying, Foley, there is hope. Yes, I know. But look, one of the great things about today, for me, is that this is the culmination of so much hard work that's been put in by a very small group of people. I mean, I mentioned Brianna and Susanna, but there's an army, there's a collective that's been working on this, and there's been some really supportive organisations. I mean, one of the great ironies of life, we're having this conference in the University of Melbourne, but we can thank Ian McLean for that, who's done some magnificent work. I'd like to thank APAN and all of the organisations and individuals who contributed to enable this as a possibility. I know that over the next 2 days, just looking at you all and having sort of observed you all finally getting to know each other during today, by the end of this conference, this is going to be, people all over the world are going to realise what I said right at the beginning. This is a landmark, historic moment. This is so fantastic. And there was one other thing that I wanted to say, and now I forgot it, but that's okay. It is... I think it had to do with you, but it doesn't matter. This has been a long ramble, I know, but this is how one can indulge oneself if one organises a conference and get to do a keynote, you know. And I have been a bit overwhelmed by just how positive this whole conference has turned out. I mean, it's exceeded our wildest expectations. I thank every single one of you for being here, and I look forward to the really positive stuff that's going to come out of this in many and probably unexpected ways over the next 3 days. And I guarantee you that every person in this room who's been here, you're here now as part of history. You know, you are part of history. And I guarantee you will never forget this conference till the day you die, folks. Thank you. You can